Welcome, welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're going to let everybody come in and get settled. So come on in, grab your coffee, your iced tea, and we'll get started in just a minute. Welcome to those that are still coming in. Come on in, get comfy. You're in for a treat. We're going to get started in just a minute here. We're going to get everybody in and get their audio connected. See a lot of people still coming into the room and getting their audio connected. So welcome to the 2022 Kansas Home Visiting Conference. We're going to give it just a minute longer because we have several people still coming in. Go ahead and get comfy. We have a treat for you this afternoon, so come on in. Hey all, welcome to the 2022 Kansas Home Visiting Conference. I know some of you are still getting in and getting connected, but my name is Crystal Dalmaso and I'm with DECA Prevention Services. Here in just a minute, you're going to hear from Lisa Williams, the Kansas Parents as Teachers Program Consultant for the Kansas State Department of Education, and you get to hear from Carrie Aiken, the Community Partnership Unit Director for the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. But first, I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. To attend a specific breakout session today, you can find a breakout session by navigating to the top right of your Pathable dashboard and clicking the Schedule tab and then Agenda. Once you find that breakout session that you're looking for, you can click that title and you'll see a Join tab, just like you just did 1 minute prior to the session start. Right now, on many of those, you'll just see the countdown, but that's how you get into your sessions for today. For those that are needing continuing education information, if you navigate back up to that top right of the Pathable dashboard, you'll see the CEUs tab. You can click there for everything you need to know about continuing education. So make sure to check that out on a break or after our sessions today. For general questions today and tomorrow, we are asking that you check out the FAQ tab. And guess what? It's back up at the top right of the dashboard. If you don't find your answer there, you can always ask one of the session moderators, or you can send me a quick email and we'll make sure to get your questions answered. Again, I want to thank you for being here today at this conference. And at this time, I'd like to invite Lisa Williams to say just a few words.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you. I am Lisa Williams, and I'm with the Kansas State Department of Education, and I am lucky enough to be the state lead for the Kansas Parents as Teachers program. So on behalf of the Department of Education and the entire planning committee, I just want to welcome you, give you a nice warm welcome to the 2022 Kansas Home Visiting Virtual Conference. So through my position with KSDE, I've learned about home visiting in Kansas, and I've learned about the variety of shapes and sizes that our work and our home visiting programs come in. With that, I've learned the importance of each home visiting program that we operate in Kansas. And I've learned how we're meeting Kansas families through these programs, where they're at with their life. The intense level of work that you do with these families and caregivers and children, it's difficult, but you know what? It's extremely rewarding, isn't it? You ask families to be vulnerable with you as you go about your work, and in turn, you're vulnerable with them. You partner with families and children to be part of their journey. Through your home visiting work, you are helping them set their goals, face their challenges and their setbacks, They're learning and they're engaging in our home visiting programs in Kansas. And in the end, we're watching these families grow, and that's just so exciting. So whether we call it home visiting, parent education, family support, family engagement, or any other term that's used to describe our work, it's clear to me that Kansas home visiting professionals play a crucial role to help families, caregivers, and children in Kansas grow to reach their full potential. Through your work as home visiting professionals, you build strong relationships with families and children, and this leads to strong communities in Kansas, and that's what we're all about. As home visiting professionals, you contribute to the Kansas Can vision, which is Kansas leads the world in the success of each child. Thank you. Thank you for all the work that you do to support the well-being and the growth of our families in Kansas and our children in Kansas. With that, I want to welcome you to the conference. I hope that you can kick back and relax a little bit and enjoy this learning opportunity with your home visiting colleagues. Again, thank you on behalf of the conference planning committee for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Aiken, my colleague at KDHE, and Carrie is going to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Lisa. I am very excited to have you all here today, specifically for this opening keynote presentation of our Kansas Home Visiting Conference. This presentation is on equity, inclusion, and diversity in Kansas. But before I introduce our speakers, I just have a couple of reminders. This session is being recorded and will be made available on the conference platform, Pathables, an hour after this session. So you can come back and review it as many times as you would like. If you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat box on the conference platform Pathables site. So you can just minimize your Zoom window and bring your web browser up and place your questions there. That will then be able to be viewed by participants who maybe were unable to attend the live session. So we also recommend that you keep yourself muted unless the presenters ask for questions and ask for you to come off mute. So I'm very excited to introduce our two opening keynote speakers, Jennifer Francois and Michelle Gilbert. So Dr. Francois is the director for the Kansas Institute of Early Childhood Education and Research at the Kansas State University. This includes supporting the Kansas Child Care Training Opportunity research initiatives and program evaluation. She's also a professor of practice in the Department of Applied Health Service Sciences, where she teaches several courses in early childhood education programs. Her research focuses on pre-service preparation and professional development in early intervention and early childhood special education, social emotional development, and language acquisition in children. Our second speaker is Michelle Gilbert. She is an early care and education specialist for Child Care Aware of Eastern Kansas, where she provides coaching and professional development to our early childhood workforce. She previously spent 20 years as a teacher and center director in both public school and community-based preschool settings. She is currently the co-chair of the Workforce Development Advisory Group, Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Work Group. She is actively involved in the Kansas Association for the Education of Young Children, where she serves as the past president and the secretary. She is also the president of the Topeka chapter of KSAEYC. So please join me in welcoming our two presenters.
Thank you so much, Carrie, Crystal, and Lisa. I think I speak for both Michelle and myself. We are extremely excited to be here this afternoon to talk to you about some of the work that's been happening across the state in equity, inclusion, and diversity. And so we've broken up this talk into a couple of different sections. I'm going to be talking about the needs assessment information that we collected in 2021 that provides a little bit of a background on child care providers' perceptions of equity, inclusion, and diversity. And then Michelle's going to talk a little bit about the work of the equity and inclusion and diversity subgroup of the Workforce Development Advisory Group. So I'm actually going to share my screen here, and I'm going to hopefully everybody can see that. Yes, okay, great. I'm seeing heads going up and down, so that's always a good sign that technology is working. Sometimes you never know. And so just to reiterate who we are, I'm Jennifer Francois. I wear a lot of different hats at Kansas State University. One of those, as Carrie was mentioning earlier, is to support research and evaluation for the Kansas Child Care Training Opportunities Organization. And so the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today is a product of the role that I play within that organization. And Michelle, do you want to introduce yourself again?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And thank you so much to the committee for having us here today. I'm Michelle Gilbert, and as Carrie said, I do work for Child Care Aware of Eastern Kansas. I'm in Topeka, and one of the things that I get to do, I tell people all of the time that my title is Early Care and Education Specialist, but that really is just a fancy way of saying that I get to do a lot of fun things. I get to go directly into classrooms and work with center directors and teachers and provide support services to hopefully improve the quality of childcare experiences and outcomes for young children.
Great, thank you, Michelle. So I thought it was important to start off with just a little bit of background on what is this 2021 Statewide Needs Assessment and why are we collecting that information. And actually, this work is part of the Workforce Development Advisory Group's work that is part of a statewide grant through the Department of Children and Families. And, and as a part of that work, we are held to do the statewide needs assessment on a yearly basis. And part of that needs assessment data this past round was to collect information on equity, inclusion, and diversity, which is what I'm going to be sharing with you today. In addition to that information, we also collect a number of other types of information around professional development and training needs, all from early childhood providers across the state of Kansas. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a couple of slides when I describe the demographics of the sample that participated this year, but the sample was very diverse, and so it was not only early childhood providers, but we had a lot of other folks from a lot of other areas and types of work participate this year in the needs assessment. So it was a pretty diverse group of folks that was providing this information. One of the other things that I thought was really important before we really dive into the information was just to provide a little bit of background on what we know around equity and inclusion and diversity, particularly around bias and how implicit bias influences the decisions that we make, particularly with certain groups of people. And the literature is very vast, I would say, in this area, particularly as it relates to health-related professions. And then we also know that bias also impacts what we do in early childhood education, particularly particularly brown and black boys, are more likely to be suspended and expelled from programs than their white counterparts. We also know that there are treatment disparities that exist in health-related professions that are directly related to implicit biases. In much of that literature, what we see is that folks who fall into more marginalized populations are less likely to receive the treatment that they need, or to even be offered that type of treatment based upon their ethnicity, their skin color. And so helping us in the early childhood field, particularly in Kansas, understand where our workforce is at in terms of their understanding of things like implicit bias and culture and diversity is really important, because it provides us a way to begin to move forward and have conversations around these very important topic areas. One other point that I'll make that I've listed up in the What Do We Know that I think is a really important one, and I think comes through in the data that we'll talk about here in a minute, is that second bullet point about intersectionality. I think that oftentimes we forget that that exists in these areas, and we overlook the fact that we see that there could be bias in both ability level and race, as an example. So I might have an African American child who has a disability, and how do those factors influence each other and influence the my perceptions of that individual person. And so I'm going to move on here and talk a little bit about the survey itself. We were really fortunate this year to have a really good response from providers across the state. The areas that are listed here are all of the areas that we collected information, but for this portion of the talk, I'm only going to focus on the demographics, giving you a little bit of background on the type of folks who participated, and then really talk about the equity, inclusion, and diversity questions that we asked the early childhood workforce. So all in all, we had about 1,500 people participate, which was, like I said, a really good response. I don't think that we had anticipated having that many people, but we were very excited when we saw the final numbers and were able to really dig into the data. I will say, before we go and move forward, as a caveat, that individual questions to our survey had varying numbers of responses, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the equity and inclusion and diversity data and how we made some decisions about the information that I'm going to present to you today. In terms of the demographics of the data set, earlier I mentioned that while we targeted early childhood professionals in the field, we had a variety of folks participate in the survey that included not only folks who are working in family child care homes and center-based care, but we had folks who were working in other areas as well, like early intervention or early childhood special education. We had some state level folks participate in our survey, and so we know that we were able to reach a very broad audience. The demographics in terms of the breakdown of the folks who participated were about 98% female, which was not surprising to me, given that we know the majority of the workforce in early childhood is female. We had fewer folks who were in the field for less than 25 years as opposed to more than 25 years. So again, that to me was not necessarily surprising. That's been a trend in some of the other stuff that and other research that I've been involved with, is that we have had a higher proportion of folks who've been in the field longer participate in a lot of different types of survey research. we had about 90% of the folks were Caucasian and 88% were in the not Hispanic or non-Hispanic category. About 55% had higher than a 2-year college degree, and about 31% had the high school diploma or GED, and 6% had a CDA. We had a fairly even, I would say, split between full day and part day programs, and a fairly similar representation from family child care providers as in comparison to the center-based care. So in terms of the equity and inclusion and diversity questions that we asked, the survey itself, the entire workforce development survey, had a lot of input from a lot of different partners that are part of the Workforce Development Advisory Group, and they provided us with questions that they were really interested in learning more about. And so Michelle and the Equity and Inclusion and Diversity Group provided the questions that you see here on the screen, and these were asked of the people who participated in the survey, and they were asked in a way that they were open-ended, so providers could respond in really any way that they chose to, and some of them did choose to reply in any way that they wanted. And so, but what we ended up seeing was some similarities in responses across the set of questions here. And so what I'm going to be talking about on the next slide is a summary of the information that came out of these questions. And before I talk a little bit more about these boxes, I think it's important to describe how we got to this information. It was a lot of work. As I said before, we had about 1,500 people respond. Not every person responded to these questions, but the number of people to respond to each of those questions that I had on the slide previously ranged from about 300 people to about 800 people. And so myself and a group of other individuals that I have working for me spent quite a bit of time going through each individual response, making some decisions, trying to categorize the responses, so basically grouping similar responses together into a theme, an overarching theme for those responses. And it ended up taking us probably like a month and a half, 2 months to go through all of the responses because there were just so many of them. Some of the questions had fewer folks participate. I want to say maybe the implicit bias was one of those where a smaller number of people participated. And so it really was a labor of love going through each of these. But in the end, it provided an opportunity for me and the people that I work with to have some really, really great conversations about the responses that the providers were providing to each of these different questions. And so the information that you see here on the slide include the overall headings or overall themes for each of these different questions. So the first box is representative of the question around what diversity means to you in early childhood education. And so we see these several themes of things like inclusion of all people, exposure. So, and by exposure, what I mean is that many of the responses said that just being exposed to people who are different than I was, different races, different ethnicities, people that speak different languages, having a program that included children who got exposed to people who were different than themselves. Uniqueness was another theme, so diversity meaning that everybody is an individual, everybody is unique. Treating people the same was also a theme that came out of the diversity questions. So the majority of questions under, or excuse me, the majority of responses under treating the same were things like being equal and fair across people, and that everybody gets the same thing. And so it was for me very insightful to begin to see how the workforce viewed diversity in comparison with some of these other questions that we asked. I think one of the things that became evident very quickly as we began to go through the responses was that there was a lot of similarity in the responses to the questions for diversity, equity, inclusion, and not, in some ways, not quite understanding the differences between each of these different topics, because we saw things like treating people the same come up in diversity as equity and inclusion, accepting everybody, allowing everybody equal access, those kinds of things as well. I think one of the other things that came up when we asked folks about implicit bias, the intent behind that question was really trying to have a better understanding of how the workforce knows what implicit bias is. I think that term, for me, I hear it a lot, hear it used a lot, unconscious bias, implicit bias. And so really wanting to understand better from the workforce about what they understand what does that mean to them. And one of the things that came up in the data around implicit bias was we had quite a few responses that just didn't know what it was. In fact, that happened a handful of times across these categories. And so I think one of the other pieces that came up across these responses was that not only just being uncertain about what do all of these terms mean and seeing them be very similar in terms of their responses, but we also had a handful of folks who were quite offended at us asking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that was, for me, surprising, some of the comments that we got around trying to push agenda and so on and so forth, which was certainly not our intent. And in asking these questions, it really was trying to have a better sense of what the early childhood workforce knows about these different areas. I think one of the other things that came out for me, as I was and have been reflecting on this data over the past year or so, is it really goes back to the point that I made earlier around the intersectionality of these different areas, particularly when it comes to inclusion. That's an area of interest of mine from particularly the special education perspective. And when we started really digging into the responses within this category, it became really clear that the majority of these responses really fell within inclusion in terms of ability level. So including children with a disability in your program, or we're accepting all kids, but that accepting all, I have to, provide a little bit more context here, really was from the lens of including all children based upon ability level. And so there was not a clear understanding that inclusion can also mean not just inclusion of ability level, but we're talking about inclusion of gender. We're talking about inclusion of family structure. We're talking about sometimes even the intersectionality of that, whether it's family, gender and race, or gender and ethnicity, or it's disability and race. And that didn't really come out in any of the responses, which was a little surprising. And in some ways I guess I should say in some ways surprising, but in also maybe other ways not as surprising, because I think that oftentimes that intersection of these things it really is overlooked, because I think that we tend to see things from like one perspective. And so for me, as we begin to think about planning for the next round of the needs assessment, I would really love to dig even deeper into these topic areas and really try and understand, I think maybe at a more specific level, about how providers are integrating these kinds of topic areas within the work that they're doing in their own individual programs. You know, I think that for us, it really does provide a snapshot into where our providers are at in terms of their own understanding of equity and inclusion and diversity. And it provides us really a starting point to begin to have more of these conversations, and knowing that we have to start off where the providers are at. We can't start off at a level that, you know, because at a level maybe up here, because our providers are still trying to understand what do these all mean to me and how do they differ from one another. And one final point that I will make that I also thought was very interesting out of the data, but again, not necessarily surprising, was that many of the responses from the providers came from the perspective of what's happening currently in their programs. And so a lot of the answers were framed within the context of their classroom or what they were doing within their classroom. As an example, culture was a really great question that included providers talking about, here's what I'm doing in my classroom to include tradition, values, and beliefs of the children in my care. And so I think in closing, and I know Michelle has some things that she's going to talk about from the Workforce Development Advisory Group, the Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Group. I think this information has really set the stage for, I hope, you know, what the Equity and Inclusion and Diversity Group is going to be doing moving forward with folks across the state. I think that that's all that I have, Michelle. So if you would like to talk about the workforce group, that would be great.
Sure. Okay, I'll let you advance the slide. Thank you. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of an overview of kind of the evolution. So where we started, and you can go ahead and advance there. There we go. And you can put both
Right.
of
Yep.
them. That's okay. So as Jennifer already mentioned, we are part of the State Workforce Development Advisory Group, and that is funded through the Department of Children and Families, but it's actually starting at the federal level. So it started at the Federal Office of Child Care, and then funded through DCF, and then Kansas Child Care Training Opportunities is the group that guides that work. And we started out as a work group called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And that was one kind of break off group from the larger Workforce Development Advisory Group. I just wanted to put a small plug in before we go on that our group meets the last Tuesday of every month at 11:30, and it's a very open group. So anyone who has an interest in the early childhood workforce as it pertains to equity, inclusion, and diversity, we would love to have you. And so you can connect with me if you would like to join us at any time. You can move on, Jennifer. Thanks. So one of the very first things that happened within our group that I think is significant to share is that we heard a presentation from Sophic Solutions out of the Kansas City area. And one of the things that they said really struck such a chord with us that it inspired a name change for our group. And that was around the idea of, so often we hear the terms diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI. And when we heard the presentation from Sophic Solutions, it was really centered around the lens of equity. And that equity means that we help each person or each child in the early childhood case get their needs met or be successful. And that if we are doing our job well, then through an equity lens, that's the starting point, and everything else will fall into place. And so that really made us as a group kind of step back and think about things differently. And we changed our name to Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity, or EID group. And I think that when we think about the work with early childhood professionals, so often we do think about, we hear the term diversity first. And as we know, working with children and families, it's diverse naturally. And sometimes it's that equity piece that is missing. And so when we changed the focus to that, we felt like it really made our conversations different. And Lisa said in her opening, she said, we work in vulnerability with families. And I think that that's what the name change, I know it sounds silly to say that a name change would do that for a group, but I think that that's what it did for us. It allowed us to have some more vulnerable conversations and to be more authentic about some of the things that we were talking about. So one of our first tasks as a group, we went through the NAEYC. Probably a lot of you are familiar with the National Association for the Education of Young Children. And in 2019, they released a position statement on equity in early childhood. And so one of the very first things that we did as a group was go through that position statement. And there are recommendations for a variety of different sectors in the position statement. And today we're going to take a quick look at 6 recommendations for everyone. Jennifer, are you able to put, yeah, there's the link that we can share again, but are you able to put the, there we go. So hopefully you all can see that. As I stated, the NAEYC position statement does break down recommendations specific to those who are providing direct care in early childhood, to those that are providing pre-service and in-service kind of training, professional development. And there's also a section of recommendations for policymakers as well. But today we thought that it would be most important for us to look at the recommendations for everyone. So the first recommendation, building awareness of our own culture, personal beliefs and values and biases. By nature, that's kind of a sensitive or vulnerable conversation anyway. I think that most of us have not had opportunities in our life to spend a lot of time in that kind of deep reflection, and that we have to step into that willingly and intentionally. And so I always share with people, I grew up in a small town in Southeast Kansas. I won't name them, but I grew up in a small town in Southeast Kansas. And the value system in that community was not standing out. The value system in that community was fitting in. It was not really ideal to be different. And so I feel like one of my personal journeys as an adult in kind of thinking about my own biases and my own lens through which I'm walking through life is to think about how that experience in growing up impacts my work with children, my work with the families, my work with early childhood professionals, and that sometimes it involves having to say, you know what, I don't really agree with how I was raised in that aspect, or that differs from who I want to be now. And that isn't always easy to confront, but it's important for us to have those conversations, not only with ourselves, but with others. And so one of the things that our group did was invite each of our members to go to the Harvard implicit bias study. And if you haven't had an opportunity to do that, I would certainly invite you to do that. If you Google Harvard implicit bias study, you can just do a very quick agreement that you understand you're participating in a study. It doesn't take very long at all. And then you can choose from different sections that you would like to do. So you might do an implicit bias test around race, around ethnicity, around gender, around age. And they just show you a series of pictures, you answer questions, and then at the end, it gives you kind of a ranking of whether you show a moderate amount of bias, a significant amount of bias, or no bias in that area. And since most of us don't have the opportunity to have someone scan our brain and go, oh, you're biased, doing the implicit bias study is one way that we can open the door for those conversations. It's a way to build self-awareness, to get information and data for ourselves, and then to take that and have conversations with other people. I mentioned having intentional conversations, and I think that's really what a lot of this work is about, is being willing and being intentional about holding space for conversations that aren't always easy. So I would just encourage you, if you haven't done the implicit bias study, to do that. One kind of side funny note, I've been in early childhood my entire life, and I did the implicit bias study around age, and it shows you different images of young people and older people. And as I said, I've devoted my entire career to working with young children and families. And when I did the age implicit bias, it showed that I had bias towards older folks. And so I thought that was very interesting. Maybe it's just the position in life. I'm feeling like I'm aging every day. So maybe that's why. But and then you can see the other 6 recommendations here in the NAEYC document as well. But that's really the big jumping off point. I'm going to end this section by just hitting briefly on number 6, the recognizing that our professional knowledge base is changing. And I think that we see this in early childhood in the direct service with childcare providers, but I think there's a direct application here in terms of home visiting as well, in that, taking that intentional opportunity to look at policies, to look at procedures, to look at application processes, things like that. One of the things that I have an opportunity to do on a regular basis is work with childcare center directors to kind of review their staff handbook or their family handbook to look for places that they might be able to eliminate bias. And one of the things that comes up semi-frequently is like on your application packet, does it still say mother, father, or do you use more inclusive language in that? I shared with Dr. Francois one of the cute kind of situations that came up recently. I was working with a center director and they had hired their very first male staff, and they were so excited that they had remembered to update their dress code in their personnel policy because they had hired a male staff. And when they updated the dress code, they updated it to say that the women could wear and men could wear. And so in updating their dress code, they actually made it less inclusive and more biased than if they would have just left it alone. But, you know, sometimes our good intentions don't always play out the way that we think that they're going to. So I think just, again, being mindful, knowing that things are changing, being willing to talk through some of those things with someone else, having a spot check with another set of eyes as you're going through things as well. So we will share the link for the entire document so that you have that as well. And you know, it's a great resource. Thank you, Dr. Francois. And we can go ahead and put the PowerPoint back up when it's handy.
And Michelle, before you go on, I might also just add, like, to your last point on recommendation number 6, where it talks about the practices and policies and how things are changing in the field. And I noted in that statement, it talks about theories and research too. Historically, in the early childhood literature, in research, the research that we have based a lot of our practices and the things that we do with young children and families on, historically has not included underrepresented populations. And that dialogue is happening more often now in the field about how we need to be more representative in the information that we're collecting, but also being more respectful in how we're going about collecting that information. And it is really exciting to see that those conversations are happening, because if you look at you know, the field of literature, the majority of the population is white middle class individuals, and we have very little international research or research that includes diversity in that. So, but I'm seeing things change, so that's good.
Thank you for pulling that out. So one of our recognitions was that a place that we could jump in as a group and make a difference was to make sure that we were bolstering our support system for the early childhood workforce. So the infrastructure that supports early childhood professionals, making sure that those that provide coaching, professional development, technical assistance, have a good base of knowledge and understanding and feel comfortable entering into conversations around the topics of equity, inclusion, and diversity. As Jennifer said, we did provide some guidance on the needs assessment as well. So this year, we had the opportunity to offer a series of 5 workshops that were led by the Institute for Public Health Innovation. And as part of that process, we're very, very specific and intentional about making sure that there was representation in the workshops from across the state, from various sectors, both state agencies, private organizations at a variety of different levels. And one of the things that there's no way that we could condense 5 workshops, 5 half-day workshops into this little short presentation. But one tool that we received that we thought might be impactful to you that we would like to share with you that Jennifer had up, and we'll go ahead and share that. It's a community engagement tool. And the idea behind this is just that as you're having conversations and making decisions, that the people that are going to be most impacted by the decisions are at the table in meaningful, real kinds of ways. And so you can hopefully see on the screen here, this tool that looks at varying levels of engagement. And one of the things that our group really had to take a hard look at is the fact that a lot of times in early childhood, when we think about the people that who is our customer, who is our client, the child and the family, and that a lot of times decisions are made on their behalf without including them in the decisions. And actually early childhood professionals as well, the caregivers as well, sometimes are in that category. And so we just found this tool really helpful as a spot check, so that when you're thinking about some of those important conversations, that you can kind of do a little quick check and see where you fit on the scale. And one of the things we had to kind of come to terms with is, if right now you're maybe down at the lower end of the spectrum in a lot of the conversations, we may not be able to, it may not be natural to, it may not feel safe to just jump immediately to collective action. But any step that we take up the ladder is a step in the right direction, and that it should be a continuous process of moving in that direction. All right, I know that we're wrapping up our time here. So 2 other things that I just wanted to share with you a little bit. One of the things that we're working on right now is creating some early childhood equity guiding principles. And what that means is we're looking at some things that we feel like should be just across the board given in terms of early childhood as far as equity goes. And these guiding principles would be shared in such a way that anyone that cares for and is invested in children and families, any organization, could take the guiding principles and either adopt them or adapt them to their organization, but just give some good language and good resources around some of the things that we think are not compromisable in early childhood in terms of equity. And then the last part of this is just that we also did an audit and are doing an audit of our professional development opportunities. So as Jennifer shared in the data, the needs assessment showed a lot of misunderstanding and maybe lack of understanding about some of the topics that pertain to equity and inclusion and diversity. And so one of the things that we're doing is making sure that our system of professional development provides opportunities for providers to learn more and to grow in those areas. And you can advance the slide, please. One of those things that we're really trying to kind of lift up is the idea that, and this is spelled out in the NAEYC position statement as well, that if we're providing anti-bias opportunities for children, that there are 4 goals. So it breaks it down into really tangible, concrete steps that early childhood professionals and really all of us can do for children. One is to make sure that they feel really good about themselves, that they have a good sense of who they are, that they're proud of their family and who they come from, and that they understand that their family, no matter what the structure, no matter what it looks like, no matter how it differs from those around them, is precious and important, and that they feel really good about that. The second area is diversity, that we help children celebrate and recognize the differences in each of us, and that we don't see those differences as problems, that we see them as opportunities. We see the differences as a way to learn more about one another and to have new information. The third area is around justice, helping children develop language for and knowledge about standing up when they hear or experience an unfairness. Even at a very young age, children can recognize when something happens that doesn't seem right or doesn't seem fair. And so giving them the support and the language to stand up for those things when they experience them. And then activism, the action part of it, doing something about it, either by themselves or with others when those injustices do occur. So that's a very short overview of the 4 goals of anti-bias education. But that just gives you a little bit of an overview, and there's more information in the NAEYC document as well. And then lastly, looking at the idea of implicit bias is kind of an abstract concept. And one of the things that we have found both in the research and just in practice is that sometimes it feels like an either or situation, that either we're a kind, caring, compassionate, nurturing caregiver, or we have bias. And that really we're trying to help early childhood professionals and ourselves understand that it's not an either or, it's a both. We can be very kind and caring and nurturing people, but we can still carry bias. We all carry bias. And so helping, one of the ways that we've tried to frame that is looking at it from a brain development standpoint. Even early childhood professionals understand brain development. We know that our brain likes patterns. We like familiar information. When I made my first cup of coffee in this morning, I didn't have to go, okay, open the cabinet door. Okay, reach my arm up and get the coffee mug. Okay, take it to the Keurig. Okay, but I didn't have to do that because my brain has created a shortcut for me. And so that's a great thing. That's helpful to us. But unfortunately, that same wonderful thing that helps us create a pattern in our brain in that positive way also sometimes allows our brain to create shortcuts in not so positive ways too. So those experiences we had in our childhood, those interactions that we might have had that were unpleasant at one point, our brain can also shortcut those and say, hey, that's bad. Don't, avoid that at all costs. And that's where some of that implicit bias can come into play. We may not even know that it's happening because it's happening behind the scenes in our brain. And so it's bringing that to our awareness, bringing that to our forefront. So I know that we are out of time. That was really, really fast. But again, thank you so much for allowing us to be here. And again, I would invite anyone that would like to join us the second or the last Tuesday of the month at 11:30. We would love to have you.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. This was a wonderful start to our conference. I do know that people are asking for that policy statement. So if we can put that in the Pathables files document, we can have folks be able to access that at any time, as well as if there's anything else that you would like to share with folks, feel free to download that. I've been looking at the chat and I'm not seeing any questions come in, but definitely if anybody has questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you here in for a few moments. I'm trying to see. Lots of thank yous in the chat, so very informative. Lots of thank yous. So again, thank you for joining us for our 2022 Kansas Home Visiting Conference. Again, a reminder, the recording will be made available in about an hour on the Pathables website. Feel free to navigate back to that internet browser, the Pathables site, to pick your next session. And that session, should have been prepared, starts in, I'm not very prepared. Let's see here. Get my agenda up here. And it signed me out. Well, you can find the agenda on the Pathables website, 1:45. Thank you, Maria. It takes a village, right? So again, thank you, ladies, for your time today out of your busy schedules. And we will go ahead and end the session, and hope everyone enjoys their first breakout session.